You're not going to believe this, but we have to talk about the regressive left today. I've actually been trying to get away from discussing the regressive left lately and instead talk about the ideas of classical liberalism, which I believe in, but current events keep dragging me back. I see on social media that people are using the phrase regressive left a bit less lately and replacing it with terms like bigoteer, the control left, or the illiberal left. Whatever name you use for this well-meaning yet painfully misguided set of ideas is largely irrelevant. We needed this phrase to identify this backwards ideology which puts groups before people, and sometimes you need a label to get people to understand an idea. The portion of the left which is no longer progressive, meaning for progress, but regressive, meaning going backwards, has been identified, and now we're clearly bringing people to the side of reason. All of you who talk about this with friends and family, who use the regressive left hashtag on Twitter, and share these videos are part of this political awakening. Yes, it seems like these backwards ideas are getting stronger in some circles, but at the same time, finally, for the first time in a long time, those of us who are liberal and open to new ideas are coming together and being heard. Whether or not you like Trump, his win was a huge rejection of the identity politics of the left. But don't take my word for that, Bernie Sanders said it himself. The only thing which can replace the regressive dissent of the left is a return to true liberalism. A liberalism which defends free speech and expression, a liberalism that is for liberty and rights of the individual, and most importantly, a liberalism that is one for human liberty. I now believe that this regressive ideology is the biggest threat to freedom and Western civilization that exists today. With the rise of Trump and the constant comparisons they make of him to Hitler, the left now has the perfect boogeyman to use to excuse anything. If your opponent is a vile racist, then you can use violence and any means necessary to stop him. The regressive left has already begun using violence as a tactic, and I fear that that's just getting started. If you're only now getting up to speed on what the regressive left is, allow me to recap quickly. The regressive, control, illiberal left, whatever you want to call it, is a group of people who place identity, usually based on immutable characteristics, in a pecking order of social importance such as race, gender, and religion, where victimhood is the highest virtue to be had. This oppression Olympics allows groups to compete for who is the most oppressed, thus the most virtuous. And if someone isn't as oppressed as you, then you have full authority to oppress them accordingly. So Black Lives Matter can protest a gay rights march in Toronto. White gay men can be banned from leading LGBT organizations on college campuses. Pro-life women can be kicked out of women's rights marches, and so on. This backwards ideology, which demands we judge each other not on the content of our character, but on the color of our skin or some other baked-in trait, puts the collective ahead of the individual. It loves all of its minority groups to behave as monoliths. So if you're a true individual, meaning you don't subscribe to the ideas that the groupthink has attributed to you based on those immutable characteristics, you must be cast out. Many of the guests on my show have suffered from this backwards backlash. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Maajid Nawaz, Sarah Haider, and Ali Rizvi all have felt abandoned by the left because they speak out about the problems within Islam. They dare to fight for a more tolerant, more truly progressive Islam in tune with a modern society and basic liberal values, and for that they're labeled bigots or worse. The Southern Poverty Law Center even labeled Maajid as an anti-Muslim extremist. In reality, Maajid's a former Islamist who has devoted his life to trying to reform Islam from the inside, to try to reconcile his faith with the modern world, fighting for gays and atheists and women and any other free thinkers living under theocratic rule. For this, he is called a porch monkey and other vile names by supposed progressives, while at the same time he's admired by many on the right for being outspoken. This is the absolute height of absurdity. But it all makes sense when you value groups over individuals. The individual must be sacrificed at the altar of the collective. So when any of these people dare speak out and call for true tolerance, they find their tolerance met with intolerance. The left loves diversity in skin color, just not diversity in thought. Of course, this regressive ideology isn't just tied to Islam at all. My guest this week is Larry Elder, a black conservative who has had every label and smear thrown at him. Again, like with the previous guests I just mentioned, these slurs come from people on the left who would rather silence and dismiss their opponents than actually engage them in an honest way. People often ask me which interview I've done that's changed my views the most, and I almost always say that it was the first time I sat down with Larry Elder. He challenged my views on systemic racism, as well as the need for a strong family, and was one of the people that helped sell me on why small government is important. If you haven't seen the video, we'll post the link right down below. We spent a lot of time talking about the left around here, but this week we're going to be diving into the right. My guest is conservative radio talk show host, lawyer, and writer Larry Elder. Larry has written several books on conservative principles with a focus on government and racial issues. Much of his work is very similar, actually, to the ideas we talk about here on the Rubin Report, including religion, the role of government, and personal responsibility. According to his biography, Larry uses facts and common sense to arrive at his conclusions. That sounds familiar, right? Now, if I use those same precepts as a liberal, can we both be right at the same time? Can we both be wrong? Is the answer somewhere in the middle? Well, that's exactly what we're going to try to find out. As I discussed with Don Lemon last week, the media talks so much about the left-right divide in this country that it's easy to forget that there are decent people on both sides of the debate. This is one of the reasons I've taken the left to task so much on this show. The further off the deep end they go, the less we'll be able to find compromise with people we disagree with. Just because I may have different views on abortion than Republicans doesn't mean that they hate all women. Just because I may have different views than Republicans on guns doesn't mean that they're a bunch of rednecks. And just because Republicans aren't for legalizing marijuana doesn't mean they aren't fun to hang out with. All right, well, that one might be true, but I think you see my point. Maybe the best way to start a conversation about political ideology is to actually define the terms. This is something I've done with a few guests so far because I often think we're all talking about different things while using the same words. Fear not, I have Google, and according to the Oxford Dictionary, here's the definition of conservatism. Conservatism is the holding of conservative principles, the tendency to resist great or sudden change, especially in politics, adherence to traditional values and ideas, sometimes opposed to liberalism. All right, so I think we have a nice jumping off point there. Basically, conservatives aren't big on change, and when they are, they want to go about it slowly. I think this concept has been conflated with the concept of right-wing politics, so I even Googled that. According to the concise Oxford Dictionary of Politics, in liberal democracies, the political right opposes socialism and social democracy. Right-wing parties include conservatives, Christian Democrats, classic liberals, nationalists, and the far right, racists and fascists. You can see how these two concepts have morphed into the Republican Party in America. We have an ideology that doesn't want to change the system too quickly, coupled with a political affiliation that is focused on economics and some level of moral authority. Interestingly, classical liberals are also included in that group, and the more and more I've been talking about this stuff, the more I've been considering myself in that category. I'm going to touch on that more in the next couple weeks. Now that we've laid out some basic terms, I think we have a solid jumping off point to discuss all the issues of the day. From abortion to economics to foreign policy to guns, can we find out where we agree instead of just yelling over each other? I think we can, but the only way is to be brave enough to talk to those we don't actually agree with. If we refuse to talk to those that we don't see eye to eye with, we'll just end up taking an eye for an eye. My guest this week is a lawyer, a writer, and host of the aptly named Larry Elder radio show. Larry, how's it going?
Well, great, Dave. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for coming in. I've been trying to make this happen with you for a while.
I've been dodging you forever. Caught up with me.
I got you. You've been in this studio before, right?
I have. I've guest hosted for Larry a couple times.
Larry King, that is.
Larry King.
That's a Larry.
The man,
thing.
yeah.
He has a thing in his contract.
For the full hour.
Yeah, he can. He can only have people with the name Larry.
That's right.
Guest host for him, so that worked out for you. So there's a lot of stuff I want to talk about, and in the beginning of the show, I set up that I am a liberal, you're a conservative.
My condolences. Maybe by the time this show is over, we can move you to the center a little bit.
And maybe by the time the show's over, we can
That's
move
not
you.
gonna,
That's not going to happen.
No, that's not going to happen.
But that's what it's all about. That's why I've wanted to have you on the show, because I find there are some people in the public space that I disagree with, but that I'd like to sit down and talk about some of the ideas.
Right.
and I consider you in that space. But before we get to the politics, I like the audience to know a little bit about the history of the people I'm talking about. So can you just, I know you were born in L.A., give me a little Larry Elder history to start.
Born and raised in L.A., my dad was a janitor. He cleaned toilets. My dad was born in Athens, Georgia. Doesn't know who his mother is. Doesn't know who his father is, rather. My name Elder was the name of some dude who was in his life the longest. My father was kicked out of his house when he was 13 years old by his irresponsible grandmother and was on his own from that point on. My mom grew up on a farm, kind of aristocracy for a black woman. She owned the farm. They owned the farm. Anyway, my dad and my mom got together and moved to California in the 40s. I have two brothers. I am, as you mentioned, a lawyer. Born and raised in L.A. and went to college in the East Coast, law school in the Midwest, stayed in Ohio for about 17 years, came back to L.A. about 22 years ago, got into TV and radio, and I've been doing it ever since.
There you go. All right, so now we got the meat of what you do. Now, you're not a practicing lawyer right now.
Negative, no.
Yeah.
No, I did it for 2.5, 3 years, and that was it.
I find a lot of people in the public space either were lawyers at one time, or I know there's a ton of comedians that were lawyers. What is it about lawyers? A lot of them want to get out. What's that about?
I'm not sure that's true. It's just a real flexible thing to do. You learn how to reason, you learn about the law, you learn about the Constitution. If you're a trial lawyer, you learn how to think on your feet, and it lends itself to doing other things. But most people I know who went to law school, at least the ones I went to law school with, stayed in the law.
Yeah, so was that a perfect segue to get you to be someone that talks for a living, right? Like instead of having to litigate it in a courtroom, you could litigate it on air and bounce back and forth with people. And
that's right. Although most lawyers are not trial lawyers. It's kind of the image of most lawyers is that they're glib and fast. Most lawyers sit behind a desk and fill out papers. They're tax lawyers or constitutional lawyers or contract lawyers or something like that. Only about 10% of lawyers end up going to becoming litigators, and even a smaller number of those actually try cases.
Yeah. All right. So now let's talk about conservatism. Let's do it. So I've mostly been calling out the left on my show because I consider myself part of the left, and I've seen the left sort of really go off the deep end to the left, and I haven't been happy about it. So I haven't talked that much about the right. I've had a couple people on the right. So first off, how would you define conservatism? What do you think that even means at this point? In America in 2016, what is a conservative?
Well, I don't mind being called a conservative. I don't consider it to be a four-letter word, but I really call myself a libertarian. I believe in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which gives the federal government a small number of things to do, Dave. Mint money, put together an army, deal with the borders, a handful of other things. That's it. Welfare, health care, abortion, same-sex marriage, doctor-assisted suicide, all the social issues that the Supreme Court takes up, in my view, they shouldn't take up in the first place. That should be done on a state-by-state basis. That's what I think most conservatives believe as well.
So I'm with you on a lot, and I definitely have some libertarian beliefs myself.
I think most people are libertarian. They just don't know it. The Founding Fathers were libertarians. The Founding Fathers drafted a document that said our rights come from a power other than individuals, and government doesn't give us our rights. We give government our rights and power, and everything else should be left to the states and to individuals. That's how the Constitution was started. That's how the country was started, and I think that's how most Americans really feel when they really think about it.
Well, that's one of the funny things to me, and why I've defended somebody like Rand Paul, who a lot of people would say as a liberal I shouldn't be defending.
He's a libertarian.
But he's a libertarian, so on issues such as legalizing marijuana or gay marriage, a libertarian, because you don't want the government in your bedroom, you shouldn't care about those issues. And as a liberal, I want people to do what they want and marry who they want. So that's somewhere where a libertarian and a liberal can really sort of join together, right?
I think so. However, you have people like Bill Maher running around calling himself a libertarian. Bill Maher is not a libertarian. He believes in higher taxes. He believes in a minimum wage. He supported Ralph Nader for government, who wants to take over businesses and have government run them. So a lot of people use it because it's a sexy kind of term and have no idea what it is.
Right. So that's the economic side of it. So you're sort of, he's liberal on the social stuff, and in a way, as a conservative, you're actually pretty liberal on the social stuff. Right?
Again, I believe that same-sex marriage, doctor-assisted suicide, all these kinds of things, abortion, should be done on a state-by-state basis. In California, we had two opportunities to vote for or against same-sex marriage. Proposition 30 and another time when we voted on, I think it was called Issue 8 or Measure 8. And in both cases, I voted in favor of same-sex marriage. In both cases, I was overruled.
Yeah.
I have no problem with the idea that the majority of my fellow Americans or fellow Californians did not agree with me. I don't believe that I then go to the Supreme Court and cram it down the throats of the other states.
Right. Okay. So then that's the states' rights issue, and sort of. So you would say that the Supreme Court is legislating from the bench or something to that effect?
Yeah, I would.
Yeah. And that so you're basically okay with what happened. You just don't like how it happened.
Correct.
Yeah. I want to get this right, so I want to look at my notes for this. According to this, you are black. Is that correct?
That is correct.
That is correct. Okay.
Not African American. That's not a term I like.
How come you don't like the term African
Ridiculous.
American?
I was born and raised in America. I've never been to Africa. Why am I an African American? Most of my people have been here longer than most of the other people in this room. Yet most people don't have a hyphen. I'm an Italian American, Greek American, Romanian American. It's an absurd term. It's a term that Jesse Jackson almost single-handedly crammed down the throats of our media. And after Jackson began to talk about why blacks should have some connection to Africa, all of a sudden, New York Times, LA Times, all of the media began using that expression. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, I personally don't use the term African American that much because one time I had a guest on the show and I referred to her as African American. She said, well, I'm actually Jamaican. So, you know what I mean? So I guess that goes to your point.
And I remember reading one time, Dave, somebody was given a description of some suspect who had done some crime, was running away, and he was described as an African American. How do you know where he was from? Could have been from Africa, could have been from Jamaica, could have been from Canada.
So what do you make of that when someone like, because I know you really rail against Jesse Jackson and these guys on the left that use, and I want to talk a lot about identity politics.
Okay.
So the guys that use these phrases, what are they going for there?
Well,
what is the goal there?
The goal is to tell black people that we're victims, that discrimination and racism remain major problems in America when in fact they don't. And they want black people to vote for the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party gets 95% of the black vote, and the reason they get it is because blacks are convinced that the #1 issue facing the country right now is social justice, racist white cops, discrimination, systemic racism, microaggression, whatever new word they come up with, and it's a bunch of nonsense. The #1 problem domestically facing this country is a breakdown of the family. And President Obama said it, I didn't. A black kid, or a kid, not just a black kid, a kid raised without a dad is 5 times more likely to be poor and commit crimes, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in jail. So you're far more likely to end up in jail without having a dad than you are because of a white racist cop.
Right. So, but you wouldn't not acknowledge that there are some systemic issues.
Give me an example. Tell me what you think the most systemic racist issue is. What is it?
Well, I would say that because black people in many cases, were descendants of slaves, that racism as an institution, that it just, a certain amount of it just exists.
2015? Give me the most blatant racist example you can come up with right now.
I think you could probably find evidence that, in general, cops are more willing to shoot if the perpetrator is black than white.
What's your basis for saying that? Last year...
Well, look, I know a lot of people would say, look what's going on in Chicago.
I know what they would say.
Yeah.
I'm talking about what the facts are. 965 people were shot by cops last year and killed. 4% of them were white cops shooting unarmed blacks. In Chicago in 2011, 21 people were shot and killed by cops. In 2015, there were 7. In Chicago, which is a third black, a third white, and a third Hispanic, 70% of the homicides are black on black. About 40 per month, almost 500 per year last year in Chicago, and 75% of them are unsolved. Where is the Black Lives Matter on that? The idea that a racist white cop shooting unarmed black people is a peril to black people is BS. It's complete and total BS. And the reason for these so-called activists saying this is the assumption that racism remains a major problem in America. The media, CNN, especially MSNBC, runs down whenever a black cop shoots somebody, and it's some march on Washington. It's ridiculous. Black people, half the homicides in this country are committed by and against black people. Last year there were 14,000 homicides. Not talking about suicides. I'm talking about homicides. Half of them were black. 96% of them black on black of that 7,000. Where's the Black Lives Matter people on that?
So there's where you would say that this is purely because of social justice. This is purely because they want ultimately for people to be angry enough to just keep voting Democrat.
That's right. And where's the evidence of the lack of social justice? When a black suspect is killed by a cop, believe me, the media is on it. People are watching it, and justice will, for the most part, occur. In Baltimore, where Freddie Gray was killed, Freddie Gray died in a van. I shouldn't say was killed. Died in a van.
Yeah.
You have a city that's 45% black. City council is 100% Democrat. The majority of city council is black. The top cop at the time was black. The number 2 cop was black. The majority of the command staff is black. The mayor is black. The AG is black. And yet here we are talking about racism. I mean, it's absurd.
Yeah.
It's absurd.
So it's funny, I find myself caught in between this a little bit as a liberal, where I want to always try to defend the other. So in this case, the other being black people, I'm always sympathetic to that. And that, at the same time, I hear you laying out a pretty solid case.
These are just the facts. I'll tell you something else, too. There was just a study, University of Washington, and it turns out cops were more reluctant, more hesitant to pull the trigger against a black suspect than a white suspect, probably because of the fear of being accused of racially profiling and the fear that the civil rights establishment was going to come down on them. So if anything, whites are more likely to be shot by a cop under certain circumstances than a black person. And in the last 30 or 40 years, the percentage of suspects killed by cops who are black has declined 75%. However, the percentage of whites killed by cops has flatlined.
Yeah.
And so if anything, people are more concerned about shooting black people for fear that they're going to be called racist. And almost every one of these incidents, whether it's Eric Gardner in New York, who died because he was selling Lucy's and resisted arrest, whether it's Tamir Rice in Cleveland, who was twirling around the gun, whether it's Michael Brown in Ferguson, who had just committed an strong-arm robbery, almost every one of these incidents involves somebody resisting arrest. Why don't you just do what the police tell you? My dad said, when I get pulled over, have my hand at 10 o'clock, have my hand at 2 o'clock, say yes, sir, say no, sir, make sure my paperwork is in order, and if I feel the cop is mistreating me, get a badge number and deal with it later on. If Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton and Obama and the whole group of them told black people to do that, we'd have a lot fewer of these things to deal with in the first place.
Yeah. All right. So I'm with you. I'm hearing a lot of what you're saying here. So as a black conservative then, who now you've laid out your case there.
But you haven't laid out yours. I asked you to name the most important example of racism, and you gave white cops going after black people. And I told you, gave you the facts for that, so that's nonsense. So you must have something else. What else is it? If you think racism remains a problem in America, give it to me.
Well, I think it remains a problem.
Give it to me. Give it to me.
It may not be systemic in that it's not like you're not being hired because you're black. There's no systemic reason, legal reason that exists, that kind of thing. But I think that racism as a general theory exists.
I need some specifics. You gave me the white cop thing. What else? Give me another example where you think is a problem.
Well, as a black conservative, tell me how do you get people to come around?
You're the one who made the assertion that you think racism remains a major problem in America. I asked you to give me an example. You gave me white cops going after blacks. As far as I'm concerned, you didn't hold it up very well. What's the other argument you have? What's the other thing? Well,
I don't know that it's systemic in the sort of macro sense.
I'm not mad. I just want to know what it is you're talking about.
That's exactly what. Believe me, that's 100% why I wanted to have you.
Blacks are not getting into school. BS. We have affirmative action. So a black person with an SAT and a GPA of X will get into a school faster and easier than a white person with an SAT or a GPA of X. And if going to school is a route to the middle class, you can make an argument that blacks have an easier route to the middle class. If you're talking about about poverty, the poorer you are, the more accessible loans and grants are for you. The problem, the biggest burden that black people have, in my opinion, again, is the percentage of blacks, 75% of them, that are raised without fathers. And that has every other social negative consequence connected to it. Crime, not being able to compete economically in the country, being more likely to be arrested, that's the number one problem facing the black community. And when I hear people tell me about systemic racism or unconscious racism, I always say, give me an example, and almost nobody can do it.
So the family stuff. So I'll follow your logic there on the family stuff. What can actually be done about that then? I mean, because that's a big
reverse the welfare state. In 1890, 1900, you look at census reports. A black kid, believe it or not, was slightly more likely to be born to a nuclear intact family than a white kid. Even during slavery, A black kid was more likely to be born under a roof with his biological mother and biological father than today. What's happened is we launched this so-called war on poverty in the 60s, where literally Lyndon Johnson sent people knocking on doors. I lived in the 60s, and people knocked on doors apprising women of their availability to welfare, provided there was no man in the house. And we went from 25% of blacks being born outside of wedlock in 65 to 75% right now. And you look at how much money that we spent on welfare, and the lines are parallel. It was a neutron bomb dropped on this country, not just on the black community, but on people in general. At one time, only about 5% of whites were born outside of wedlock. Now 25% of whites are born outside of wedlock. I was in college in 1970, and there was a report called the Moynihan Report, The Negro Family, A Case for National Action. It's written by a liberal, by a man who became a Democratic senator from New York. And at the time, 25% of black kids were born outside of wedlock. He said, my God, this number is horrific. If we don't do something about it, it could get even higher. Well, fast forward, 25% of white kids are now born outside of wedlock. It is the #1 problem in this country. And what we've done, in my opinion, is we've economically incentivized women to marry the government, and we've allowed men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility. And now we have this.
So do you think,
the left has done this.
Right. Okay. So do you think then that as a black conservative, that the biggest issue is it's impossible to have this conversation? Right. Like the stuff we're talking about right now is rarely really discussed in the media. You know, you've written some books about it, and it's people talk about it every now and again, but we rarely have this discussion because, and this is where I will agree with you, that the left has made language such a problem, and everyone's so trigger warned and safe space that we're afraid that if you have this conversation, that somehow I'm going to come off racist.
That's not where we don't have the conversation. We don't have the conversation because the left would then have to look in the mirror and go, Jesus H. Christ, look at what I've done. And they don't want to do this. I've had a radio show for almost 25 years. I've invited Jesse Jackson on 50 times, 60 times. I've invited Al Sharpton on that number. Maxine Waters, another loudmouth black woman around here who's running around talking about racism. She won't come on my show either. They don't want to deal with these issues. Why? Let's have a conversation. If I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong. Tell me how I'm wrong. Give me your data. Give me your facts. Tell me what you got.
Yeah.
And I could quote the Brookings Institution, which is a liberal think tank, and the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank, and they'll both tell you that there's a relationship between crime and bad schools and going to prison and not having a dad. So this is not just a liberal kind of thing or a conservative kind of thing. It's a real world kind of thing, and they don't want to have that conversation. I've never heard a reporter ask Obama about the connection between the rise of the single-parent household and the rise of welfare spending. I've never heard anybody ask him that question, not one time.
Yeah.
And so, as far as I'm concerned, there's this desire not to have this conversation for fear that it then will cause you to rethink your assumptions. A psychologist would call that cognitive dissonance. This anxiety that you feel when you have had your assumptions challenged and you don't want to do it. It's uncomfortable.
Yeah. So how then would someone like you or someone that believes in the things that you're talking about, how do you wrestle away a little bit of the narrative from the Black Lives Matter folks? Because obviously you
tell the truth.
You care about the same things.
Of course
right?
I do. I tell the truth. I talk about the #1 cause of preventable death for young white men is car accidents. The #1 cause of preventable death for young black men is homicide committed by other young black men. I tell the truth. I give the facts. And the facts are racist.
Yeah. So the facts are racist.
Facts are racist.
Right.
Hashtag facts are racist.
Right. So, I'm friends with another black conservative, David Webb. You probably know him on Sirius XM, and he's a Fox News contributor. And I had been doing a progressive show a while back, and I was on with someone, and they didn't know him personally, nor knew that I was friends with him.
Right.
And they kept saying he's the token black guy on Fox.
Right.
Now, I'm sure you get plenty
Oh,
of
my
this
goodness.
kind of thing.
Token, bootlicker, Uncle Tom, Sambo Tom, coconut as in brown on the outside, white on the inside, Oreo, same concept, the Antichrist.
Man, you got a whole list.
Because they've got to malign somebody like me. I am a bigger threat to their whole ideology than almost anybody else. A black guy who does not believe that he's a victim, a black guy who believes in hard work and personal responsibility, a black guy who doesn't believe in handouts, a black guy who doesn't believe in the welfare state, a black guy who doesn't believe in affirmative action. I am the antithesis of everything they stand for, and therefore I can't just be dealt with facts and rebutted with facts. I've got to be maligned. I've got to be cast away. I've got to be treated as if I'm Darth Vader. That's what the left does.
So that's interesting, and again, this is where I've really struggled with my guys on the left, because in a way that is actually showing
It's racist. Of course it is. It's bigotry.
Right, because
I don't have the same right to have an opinion as somebody else. I've never heard Rush Limbaugh be called anti-white because he criticizes Hillary and the left. But I criticize black left people, and I'm anti-black. It's bigotry. It's racism. Calling somebody an Uncle Tom is as offensive as calling somebody an N-word lover.
Yeah. So when it comes to the black community and politics, so I got you on a bunch of this stuff. The black community, in a lot of ways, isn't for some of the things that the Democratic Party is for, right? Because the black community, a lot of times, and it has a lot to do with the church, is more socially conservative.
The only thing that connects black people to the Democratic Party, in my opinion, is this notion of social justice and this notion that racism remains a major problem in America. Look down the list of things that black people like and support. Blacks are more pro-life than whites are. Blacks were more anti-gay marriage than whites were. That's one of the reasons that Proposition passed here in California, is because of the way blacks and browns voted. Again, I didn't vote that way, but it's the way a lot of blacks and browns did. Blacks want to be wealthy. One of the reasons Donald Trump is getting about 25% of blacks, which is 5 times, by the way, the percentage that Mitt Romney got, is because of Donald Trump's swagger and his being proud that he's made money. And so, and in the inner city.
Wait, that's a really fascinating little piece right there.
One more quick one. This is really important. The Democratic Party is completely beholden to the teachers union and vice versa. The union is adamantly opposed to vouchers, where the money follows the kid rather than the other way around. Inner city black women and fathers, and inner city brown women and brown fathers want vouchers. They realize the schools suck. I went to Crenshaw High School in South Central. Right now, 3%, that's not a typo, 3% of kids can do math at grade level. I'm going to send my kid to that school because I don't have enough money to send my kid to a better school. It's an assault. There's a program called the DC Hope Scholarship Program, where every year parents who subscribe to the program, and it's 4 times as many people want to get in as there are seats, will give kids about $10,000 to $12,000 to go to a non-DC government school. And every 2 years, when it's over, Obama and the Democrats try to shut it down. And the reason they don't is a bunch of black parents go to the streets, have a press conference, start crying, and say, "Oh, my kid's doing better." I can't think of anything more damaging to a kid's future is to send him to a school where it's a Crip school, where the kids are not learning, where a lot of them are not learning because they don't care, and where the whole level is now dumbed down to cater to the lowest common denominator in a class. And as a result, you have kids that have poorer SAT scores than they otherwise would if they had a chance to go somewhere else that challenged them. And so inner city parents want vouchers. Young black people, when they're told about the benefits of privatizing Social Security, want to do it because 65 years old, blacks die sooner than whites do. And when you die, all your contributions to Social Security go poof, as opposed to being able to will it to your child. When blacks are taught about this, young blacks want the opportunity to put their money into an account that they can control, so when they get 65 years old, they have real money. So privatizing Social Security, vouchers, abortion, same-sex marriage, all of these issues, blacks are really not in lockstep with the Democratic Party. But the Democratic Party has successfully convinced blacks that racism, this white cop, this is widespread, the man's out to get you, and vote for us and we'll deal with it.
So how much of this is a messaging problem? If I grant you all of that, right, how much of this is just a messaging problem by the Republicans? Because it seems to me, and I've said this several times, that someone like Tim Scott, who is a black Republican senator from the South, he should be a hero, not only of the black community, but he should really be a hero of the left, right? Because this is a successful black
He should be an American hero.
He really should be. I mean, he should certainly at the very least, be bigger in the national debate. Why isn't he a bigger surrogate for whoever he's going to support? I assume it will be a Republican. Why is this guy lost in the scheme of things?
Well, it's the same reason that blacks vote 95% for the Democratic Party. He is considered to be an Uncle Tom. He's a Republican. He's a black Republican. He's some sort of unicorn. I don't know what he is. That's how they feel.
So then, what do you do? What do you do as a Republican to break this narrative? You know, I got it. You tell the truth. I got it. You tell the truth. But obviously, there has to be something bigger than messaging here, because you're telling me the numbers, 90, 95% vote Democrat.
It's an uphill fight. I mean, to me, there is a access of indoctrination. You have the media, you have academia, and you have Hollywood, all of which tell black people that they're victims. Most professors are to the left. The media certainly is all to the left, and Hollywood's to the left. And so you get up and you're indoctrinated all the time with things like social justice, inequality, the man's out to get you, we need a higher minimum wage. You name the left-wing policy, and you pick it up through osmosis. That's why when we first started the conversation, I said I hope to move you towards the center, and you say I hope to move you towards the center. And I said it's not going to happen because there's nothing you can tell me I haven't heard, but I probably can say some things your audience hasn't heard, because LA Times, New York Times, CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS, New York Times, you name it, these are all to the left. Whatever left-wing position, you're going to hear it. You're going to hear why, how, and where. But the other position you won't hear unless you watch Fox News or listen to talk radio, and a lot of people won't do it if you make them, if you pay them.
Right. So I hope it's clear in our 40 minutes or so together so far. When I say I'm on the left, I consider myself a classic liberal in that I stand for liberal principles.
John Stuart Mill type liberal.
Exactly, exactly.
That's not a liberal.
And I know in a lot of ways
that makes you a conservative. You're a Jack Kennedy kind of Democrat. He cut taxes.
Right.
He was a coal warrior. He liked hunting. He liked the Second Amendment.
So doesn't this show you how stupid the words are? So what I did at the top of the show...
No, it shows you how the Democratic Party has evolved to the left and abandoned principles. My mom was a Democrat. My mom was a Republican. My dad was a Republican all his life. And my mom stopped voting for the Democratic Party. And she said, as many people have said, I didn't leave the Democratic Party, they left me. She didn't like welfare. She didn't like the idea of rewarding people just because you had a kid and then giving you more money when you had an additional kid. She didn't like any of all of that.
Right.
And she started voting for George W. Bush her last two election cycles.
So it's really ironic that...
It's not messaging. It's the fact that the country in general has gone to the left, and the Democrats to a greater degree than Republicans have gone to the left. The country has changed, in part, in my opinion, because of immigration, including illegal immigration. People who are coming to the country illegally from third world countries like Mexico, they don't know what I'm talking about when I talk about limited government. They believe health care is a right. They're taught that in Mexico. They're taught that other places. And they come here in America, and they pull that lever for the Democratic Party, which is why, in my opinion, the left wants borders to be porous, because it changes the country.
Right.
Changes the electorate.
It changes the demographics and all that.
The Democratic Party has not won the white vote since 1964. The more white people there are in the country, the worse Democrats do. The more left-wing, the more people of color there are in the country, the best the left does. And so what incentive is there for them to police the borders? What incentive is there for them to shut down sanctuary cities, to stop catch and release? There isn't. In my opinion, there's been a very subtle and very diabolical changing of the mentality of this country by left-wing people, so that a state like California could never vote for Ronald Reagan as they did in the past, could never vote for Richard Nixon as they did in the past. You have New York and California, just write them off. And there's 10 or 12 states now that we fight over. Everything else is now written off. It's ridiculous.
Larry challenged me, and I wasn't ready, so I can't say that it was my best moment on camera, but I listened and learned, and just as importantly, we didn't edit any of it out. So I'm looking forward to picking up where Larry and I left off. And as for where we left off, this is where I feel there might be nothing left for me on the modern American left. You all know most of my positions on important issues. I'm for free speech, even for white supremacist Richard Spencer to speak and not get punched in the face, as happened just a couple days ago. And I'm still a card-carrying liberal, by the way. I'm for gay marriage, I'm pro-choice, I'm pro-legalization of marijuana, I'm against the death penalty, and the list goes on. At the same time, though, I'm against this oppression Olympics. I'm against safe spaces and trigger warnings. I'm against labeling all my opponents bigots and racists, and I'm against deplatforming speakers, especially at colleges where ideas are meant to be challenged and debated. I'm also for states' rights, for following the Constitution, and most importantly, for having a limited government that gets out of the way so that you can live your life to the fullest. I've said a few times on the show that defending my liberal principles has become a conservative position. Interestingly, I've also heard conservatives like Andrew Klavan and Dennis Prager say that they are conservatives because they really are liberals. This is where we might get lost in the definition of liberal in the modern sense versus classical liberal. So if you're still confused about that, check out a video I did a couple weeks ago called Why I'm a Liberal. We'll put a link to it right down below. The point is that if the issues I care about most, free speech, rights of the individual, and limited government designed to maximize liberty, now have almost nothing to do with the modern left. My positions basically haven't changed, but I've watched as my team has gone off the deep end. The battle of ideas always gets to a tipping point, and I sense that we're closing in on one right now. If we can't rein in this madness on the left, then Donald Trump will be all too happy to show them his authoritarian side. Both sides are ramping up for a showdown. That seems incredibly obvious to me. So while I absolutely believe that the new center filled with liberals, conservatives, and libertarians and others is rapidly growing, maybe I've lost the left, and maybe that's okay. But to end this direct message, I now kick this back to you guys. If you're liberal, is there anything left for you on the left, or are you left out? Is it now the conservative position to truly be liberal? Let me know in the comments right down below, and we'll see if there's anything left to discuss. Joining me this week is an author, a television pundit, host of a nationally syndicated radio show, and now most importantly, a returning guest in that very chair. Larry Elder, welcome back to the Rubin Report.
Dave, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, I am looking forward to this because I mentioned at the top of the show that I don't know that any guest that I've ever had on challenged me directly as much as you did and actually managed to change some of my feelings. That's got to feel pretty good for you.
Well, I had a lot of good feedback from the interview, and people complimented me, but I said the compliment should go to you because you were asking questions, and unlike a lot of interviewers, you really cared about the answer. You listened, and then you responded. And so I think that's what made the interview so great.
So for you to sit down with a liberal, and I think last time we literally didn't know each other. I think maybe we had met for 10 seconds before you sat in the chair. You sit down with a liberal, and I think that you were ready to go. So when I said something about systemic racism, like you were ready to pounce, and you did. And my guy said to me after, we had only been doing the show for a few months, do you want to edit that part out? Because there's a part where you really kind of catch me in like a moment where I don't know. And we'll link to it right down below. I want people to see this. I think it's important. How hard is it for you to sit down with liberals, generally speaking, and have an honest conversation?
Depends on the liberal. If it's an open-minded liberal who really cares about what you have to say, it's pretty easy. If it isn't, if it's somebody who's already decided what they've decided and believe that liberals, that conservatives are mean people, rotten people, cold people, anti-science people, then we're going to be in for a bumpy night.
Right. Okay, so let's, I want to just recap a couple of the things we talked about last time for people that haven't seen it, and then we'll get to all the new stuff. So real quick, just tell me a little bit about your political evolution. How do you end up here as a conservative?
Well, it wasn't so much an evolution as it was kind of like a series of things that happened to me, people that I've met, books that I've read, and that all together you added up, and I ended up being a conservative. My father was always a Republican. My mom, a Democrat, and so at the kitchen table, they would fight all the time about politics. And when I was younger, I sided with my mom, I think partially because it was just my mom. And when I got older, I began to side with my father, much to my mother's consternation.
So racism, this is the issue that more people contacted me about when I was discussing you than anything else. And it's where you challenged me the most on systemic racism. So first off, does any racism exist in America? Not systemic racism, we'll get to that in a sec, but what racism is real right now?
We live in a country that's got 330 million people. Roughly 8 to 10% of them believe Elvis is still alive. Almost half of them believe if you send Elvis a letter, he'll get it. Obviously, there's racism. There are individuals who don't like other people because of their race. No question about it. But are there corporations that have a policy of not hiring anybody? Are there governmental agencies that have a policy of not hiring anybody? The answer is no. If you can tell me the company, IBM, Apple, that has a policy of not hiring black people, tell me, or brown people, tell me who that company is, and we can deal with it. I don't know what people mean when they talk about institutional racism. If this were the 50s, I would know what you're talking about. When there was segregation that was legal segregation in the South, where you couldn't marry somebody outside your race in certain states. But that is no longer the case right now. The racism that people talk about right now, in my opinion, is individual stuff, where some individual doesn't like you, or some individuals don't like you. But is it something that is anything akin to what we experienced in the 50s and the 60s? Absolutely not. And I think it's insulting to people who have fought hard and died in the 50s and the 60s to get us to this point, to act like things are just the same.
Yeah.
When you have people like Eric Holder saying, as he did when he was AG, we now have pernicious racism, which he said was every bit as bad as the old racism. What the hell are you talking about? I mean, it's insulting to me.
So what do you do to defeat that idea? So again, this is, you mentioned that in our conversation, and it really did, you got me. I said something, well, there's systemic racism. And you said, well, what companies can I
just asked you for an example.
Yeah, you got me. And so I do agree with you. There are racist people. There are a certain amount of people that don't like black people, that don't like Jews, that don't like gays, etc. We live in a free country. You're allowed to not like people.
That's
it
right.
may be odious and unpleasant, but you're allowed to. You can't harm them, but...
Correct.
But what do you do to stop the idea of what you're talking about, that things have changed for the better and that there's a certain amount of people that want that oppression, that want the oppression because it sort of puts them above other people? How do you fight that? You've been trying to fight it, I think, for a long time.
Tell the truth. That's how you fight it. Tell the truth. I mean, this movement called Black Lives Matter, I think we talked about that a little bit. It's as bogus and as phony a movement as the notion that O.J. Simpson is innocent from having killed 2 people. It's a fraud. Most cops simply want to do a good job and come home. Most cops, frankly, are more hesitant to pull the trigger against a black suspect than a white suspect. There have been a couple of studies that have shown that recently. One of them was an economist from Harvard named Roland Fryer. And he is apparently the youngest tenured professor in the history of Harvard. And he's a tenured professor in the Department of Economics. And he did a study to find out about police brutality. He assumed he would find the opposite. And he was shocked, he said, when he found out that most police officers are more reluctant to use deadly force on a black suspect than a non-black suspect. And the reason, in my opinion, is pretty obvious. If you shoot a black person and there's any question whatsoever about it, you're going to be under the gun. You're going to be possibly prosecuted, maybe lose your pension, maybe go to jail. Cops are deathly afraid of being perceived as engaging in racial profiling. There was a recent poll that just came out, and it turns out 75% of cops said that they are more reluctant now to engage with citizens than before the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah. So what's the disconnect then? When you see these cities, when you see Atlanta and you see Chicago and you see Ferguson and all of these places that are usually under Democratic control, they usually have Democratic mayors.
Right.
The groupthink would tell you, wait a minute, Democrats are helping black people. So where is the disconnect coming from?
A lot of people are not thinking critically, Dave. They're just not. Take Baltimore. Baltimore was run by a black mayor. She got 85% of the vote. What kind of politician gets 85% of the vote?
Yeah, I think Gaddafi got 85%.
I think Stalin got 105%.
Yeah.
And the top 2 officials running the police department were black. The command staff, majority black. All of city council Democrat, majority black. The state attorney, the one who brought the charges against the 6 officers, is a black female. And yet and still, they're still talking about systemic racism. The fact of the matter is a lot of black suspects are engaging in bad conduct, and the police are doing their job. And often the bad conduct is against another black victim.
Yeah. Does this all come down to education for you? Because at the end of the day, if you can teach people properly about history, and if you can teach them properly about what the role of government is and all of those things, that's really how you untie this stuff from just the screeching people on both sides.
I think so, but it's also all about rationally connecting the dots. Is it really true that a young black man is more likely to be pulled over by a cop than a young white man? And if it is true, another question is why? And you cannot have a meaningful discussion about any of this without talking about behavior. I think maybe the last time we were here, we talked about a National Institutes of Justice study. That's the research arm of the DOJ. They did a study that came out in 2013 called Traffic Stops and Race. And it turns out that whether you're talking about driving without a license or driving while drunk or driving with a busted tailpipe or driving without a seatbelt or driving without a car seat in the back, it turns out black motorists were more likely to commit those crimes than a white motorist. And the study said that the differences in stopping have to do with differences in offending. If you can't have a meaningful discussion unless you have a meaningful discussion about behavior.
Right. Now, I suspect that some people on the left would hear that and they'd say, well, black people have been oppressed economically, so they are more likely to have a taillight out or some other thing. You would just say that's nonsense. You would just say that's individual responsibility. You got to drive a car that's supposed to be the one that's on the
Well,
road.
that's right. Also, there's more poor white people in the country than there are poor black people, but it's black people that complain about being disproportionately pulled over.
Yeah.
Half of all the homicides in this country involve black victims. Almost all of the black victims were killed by other black people. I don't know what that has to do with cops being racist. It has to do with the fact that a disproportionately large percentage of crime is committed by a small percentage of people, usually males, usually young black males, often against their peers. And that is because of the lack of fathers in the home. I didn't say it, Obama said it. A kid raised without a father is 5 times more likely to be poor, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in jail. The number one problem facing this country is not bad cops, not Obamacare. It is the large number of children raised without fathers. That is a product of the welfare state. Between 1890 and 1920, 1930, believe it or not, a black kid was slightly more likely to be born to mothers and fathers married to each other than a white kid.
So what's the connection there? What's the 1920 connection? So the welfare state starts, and why does that harm the black family more?
The welfare state really got kicked off in the mid-'60s. 25% of black kids were born outside of wedlock in 1960.
Yeah.
Right now it's 73%. And what happened is literally Lyndon Johnson launched a so-called war on poverty, and he sent workers literally knocking on people's doors to apprise women of their right to welfare, provided there was no man in the house. And so what we've done is change the culture. We've incentivized women to marry the government. We've allowed men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility. It is a neutron bomb dropped on this country, all because of the war on poverty that was done by Lyndon Johnson and the Democrats, and with tacit support by Republicans as well.
Do you think the intentions were
one
good?
quick thing, and we know that there is a negative incentive, because in 1996, when Bill Clinton signed the Welfare Reform Act of 1996, welfare declined by over 50%. Far steeper than anybody predicted. It turned out there was a bunch of able-bodied people and able-minded people sitting on couches, and when the jig was up, they got off the couch and got to work.
Yeah. Do you think the intentions are good? So when Lyndon Johnson pushes this, when the Democrats sign it, the Republicans who got on board, were their intentions we're going to help people get out of poverty, or is there really something more nefarious going on?
No, the intentions were quite good. FDR talked about the corrosive effect of government dependency when he launched the New Deal, and Lyndon Johnson talked about getting people off of government dependencies and making them more self-sufficient by launching the war on poverty. Those were their stated goals, and I believe them. But human nature is such that if you allow somebody an easy out, some people will take an easy out. And that's what we've done with a lot of people.
So basically we've said to a certain subset of people, and it I guess is a disproportionately amount of black people, we've said you can get a certain amount of government handouts. And basically your argument is that this is now just leaving people in the status quo, because if you can get something, subsidized housing, whatever it is, food stamps, and you don't have to do anything, you'll just take it. That's not a black characteristic. That's a characteristic of what any human might
of human nature. And there was a poll taken in 1986 by the LA Times. They asked poor people and non-poor people a bunch of questions, and one of them was, do you believe that poor people have additional children to get additional money from welfare? The majority of non-poor people said no. They probably thought that was insulting, if not racist. 64% of poor people said yes. Also, they were asked this question, poor people were, do you believe that welfare is a crutch, creates dependency, or do you believe it's a means to get you to stand on your own 2 feet and go forward? More of them said it was a crutch that created dependency than it was a means to get you on your own 2 feet and go forward. These are poor people responding to this poll.
Yeah. So basically guilt has a lot to do with this. The guilt, sort of white liberal guilt in a way, has actually subjected black people to not all black people of course, but a certain subset of poorer black people to a set of circumstances that they almost can't get out of.
I think that's part of it, but also I think part of it is people that are comfortable and wealthy and well-educated look around to figure out how they can perfect the world. And they forget that part of getting anywhere is overcoming obstacles and struggling. And if you make things real comfortable for people, some people are going to take the easy way out. So I think it's a kind of mindset, the kind of mentality.
Yeah. When did we get to that point where fighting for what's yours, fighting that no one should give you anything, that the government isn't supposed to give you anything, and no one should, that it is your life to live, it's your job as a human to pursue what makes you happy and take what you can. That doesn't mean destroying everything around you, but finding what makes you happy. When did that get crossed up? Is it all connected to this, do you think?
That's a good question. I think the founding fathers intended for us to have what people have characterized as rugged individualism. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution set forth a handful of things that the federal government should do. They did not include Social Security, they did not include Medicare, they did not include Medicaid, they did not include charity. But we've gotten away from that. I think because as people become more and more affluent, they look around and try to perfect the world.
Yeah. Would you roll back all of those things?
I would.
know, do you consider yourself a libertarian?
I do.
You're basically a libertarian,
Yes.
right? So you would
small L libertarian.
Small
I'm a law and order libertarian.
so you think there should be driver's licenses?
Of course.
Yeah. So you're not like, well, because it's an important distinction to make, because there are plenty of libertarians that don't. So what makes you not a classical liberal then? Because this has become one of the themes over the last year.
I am a classical liberal in the John Stuart Mill sense of it.
Yeah.
Absolutely, I am. Somebody who believes in maximum personal freedom, but also you have to believe in maximum personal responsibility, and that is to deal with the consequences of your choices.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't want to do that. They want to shield people from the vestiges of the world, of life. And when you do that, you also will create some other kind of reaction that'll be worse. My father used to say, when you try and get something for nothing, you often end up getting nothing for something.
Yeah. So what sort of social safety net should there be then? Or do you not think that there should be? And this may be the difference between a small L libertarian and a classical liberal.
I think most classical liberals will feel the way I feel, and that is that the safety net should be provided by other individuals, not by government, but by churches, nonprofits. One of the things that Alexis de Tocqueville wrote about in Democracy in America were all of these what were called mutual aid societies that were set up. This is before Social Security, before Medicare, before Medicaid, and believe it or not, a black person living in Chicago in the 1920s and 1930s was more likely to have health care insurance than a white person because he joined these mutual aid societies that provided that.
All right, so let's circle back to the family stuff, because I remember you said the family stuff last time and the importance of a two-parent family. My parents are still married 40 some odd years. I just went back to my childhood home in New York, and for the first time I think I saw a little more tangibly what you were talking about. To go to my parents' house, to feel that it was the same place that I grew up in, the same community that I was part of. I visited family, friends, and some relatives that were nearby. And it did feel like it connected me to something that was important. It's sort of an ephemeral thing. It's something that's not quite tangible, but something that's important it lays your roots, so to speak, and that you can sort of figure out who you are from that. Is that really what you're talking about with the family? That it's not just that there's a breadwinner, but something else, something that's sort of bigger than that really can lay out what a life is supposed to be.
Absolutely. It's not just an additional check, as you pointed out. It's also being a role model, watching your father get up, go to work when he doesn't feel like it, watching him live up to his responsibilities. And you know, the three arguably biggest leaders in this country, black leaders in this country, are Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, and Louis Farrakhan. And all of them had difficult,
that's a trio, huh?
All of them had difficult, if not non-existent relationships with their own fathers. Jesse Jackson's mother was a teenager who was impregnated by the married man who lived next door. And when Jesse Jackson was raised in South Carolina, kids taunted him. Jesse ain't got no daddy, Jesse ain't got no daddy, because that's how rare it was in those days to be raised without a father. Al Sharpton had a nice middle-class life until his father abandoned the family and then down to the ghetto. And in the case of Farrakhan, his mom was estranged from her husband, had a boyfriend, took back up with the husband, got pregnant, didn't want the boyfriend to know, and tried to abort Louis Farrakhan with a coat hanger. So all three of these men, in my opinion, have deep psychological issues because of a lack of relationship with their own fathers. And that is one of the reasons why, in my opinion, they're so angry, despite the fact that things have gotten so much better in terms of race relations in this country.
So basically, they can't let go of that. I mean, not to fully psychoanalyze them,
Right.
but they're dealing with a personal pain that is extremely painful, for sure. And they can't let go of that pain, so now they're kind of projecting it onto the rest of us via politics.
In my opinion, again,
Yeah.
I'm not a psychologist,
You're
but
right.
if I were, that's what I would say. Now, a lot of people have had bad circumstances and have not been that sour because of it. My father, I think we talked about him before. My father does not know who his biological father is. The man named Elder was the man who was in his life the longest. He was an alcoholic who abused him and abused his mother physically. And my dad was literally thrown out of the house when he was 13 years old by his mother's then boyfriend, who sided with her boyfriend when he and my dad got into a quarrel when he was 13 years old. Came home from school school, and he was making too much noise. The boyfriend got mad. My dad said something to him. His mother sided with the boyfriend. Out of the house he goes.
Wow.
13 years old, Jim Crow South, Athens, Georgia, right at the beginning of the Great Depression. My father was never angry, though. My father said to us, always, us meaning my two brothers and me, I picked up the cars, I dealt with them the best that I could.
What did he do? What did he do?
A series of whatever anybody would pay him to do. Cleaning this, cleaning that. Ultimately, he got a job with the Pullman Porters. They were the largest private employer of blacks in those days. And he was able to travel around the country. That's how he ended up in California. He came here one time. It was sunny. People smiled. It seemed more friendly. And after the war was over, my dad relocated to California to try and get a job as a cook. And he was told that he had no references, which was California's way of saying we don't hire black people.
Right.
And my dad ended up being a janitor, worked 2 full-time jobs as a janitor, saved his nickels and dimes, started a little cafe near the Pico Union area, which he ran until his 80s.
Wow.
In fact, I wrote about this in my last book. It's called Dear Father, Dear Son, 2 Lives, 8 Hours, because my father and I did not get along. I thought of my father as grouchy and ornery, and I couldn't understand why he was so ill-tempered until I got 25 years old. We stopped talking to each other when I was 15. We didn't speak to each other for 10 years.
Wow.
And my dad and I sat down for what I thought would be a 10-minute conversation. It ended up being an 8-hour conversation. And that's why I wrote the book, Dear Father, Dear Son, 2 Lives, 8 Hours, about this conversation.
Do you think that, despite what you've said about President Obama, do you think that now that he's out of office, maybe he could step into the role that you'd like to see him in? So instead of America turning to Jesse Jackson and Farrakhan and Sharpton, maybe they can turn to you, but if not to Larry Elder, that maybe Obama, when you disconnect it from politics, can actually talk about some of those things. Because, I mean, you addressed it a second ago. You said he did mention the family and mention fathers and all that. Yeah. So is there a chance? Do you think there's a chance for that? I'm
not optimistic because in his last press conference, he talked about we still have a great deal to do on race. By the way, when people talk about a great deal to do on race, all they really mean is how black people feel about white people and vice versa. They don't care about Hispanics. They don't care about Asians. They really care about the relationship between blacks and whites. And Obama has, throughout his 8 years, in my opinion, when he could have ignored the race card or put it in perspective, picked it up. Whether it's Cambridge Police or whether it's Trayvon Martin, if I had a son he would look like Trayvon, or whether it's invoking Ferguson, whether it's hiring somebody like Eric Holder who's lecturing the country on race and racism. Obama, I think, believes that racism remains this huge, massive problem in America despite his election and despite his re-election. Yeah. And I don't. And so I don't think he's going to say the right thing and do the right thing. I think he's encouraged black people to think of themselves as victims, as opposed to saying, look at me, I busted my butt. My parents made sure I had a good education. I didn't make bad moral mistakes. I got married before I had kids. Follow my model and you'll be fine. He has not said that at all. What he said is, we have real problems in this country. He embraced the Black Lives Matter movement. I mentioned Trayvon Martin. I mentioned some of the other things. In my opinion, the reason that a lot of people voted for Obama was because they thought he was going to do exactly what you suggested, which is to heal us, put things in perspective. Tell young black people they ought not be angry when they're pulled over by a cop. All the cop is doing is his job. Instead, he did the opposite. So I'm not optimistic at all that he'll play that kind of role that you suggest. Yeah, so the way we've demonized... I hope I'm wrong. Yeah, I hope you're wrong too. I don't know. But the way we've demonized cops as part of this, I agree. I mean, I see a lot of times people are just screaming about how evil cops are and they're hunting people down and all of this stuff. I don't know a ton of cops, but I knew some in New York and I know a couple here. I mean... generally they're trying to do good, right? I mean, do you have any experience in which, have you ever been pulled over and had a bad experience? I probably have been pulled over maybe more than almost anybody you know. I got my driver's license when I was 15 and a half, my learner's permit, and then when I was 16 I was able to drive by myself, and I probably looked like I was 12. So I got pulled over probably 100 times, and with the exception of 1 or 2 instances, the encounter was brief and professional. One time a cop told me to take my head out of my ass. That was the first time I got pulled over, by the way. Yeah. I was driving and there was a light behind me and I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, so I just kept going. The guy pulled over and screamed at me and he goes, "Why didn't you pull over?" And I said what I said to you. "Well, officer, I didn't think I did anything wrong." And he said, "Whenever you see some lights behind you, you pull over, get your head out of your ass." And he was right. I should have had my head out of my ass. The instances in which cops kill blacks has declined 75% in the last 45 years, according to the CDC, while the instances in which cops kill whites has pretty much flatlined. And so It's going down. It is very, very, very rare for the cops to kill anybody, let alone an unarmed black person. Of the 965 people that were killed by the police in 2015, less than 4% were white cops killing an unarmed black man. It is very rare. By contrast, 400 people were injured by lightning last year, but only 250 people were killed, black people were killed by police. So it's very, very rare.
So how much of this, I know you talk about fake news and I want to get to that, but how much of this is because the media is complicit in all this? So for example, just this morning, I think the Oscar nominations were put out. I haven't even seen them yet, but apparently there are more minorities this time. I guess there are some more Latinos and Dev Patel and some more black people.
Right.
And you know, for the last couple of years, there's been this Oscars so white thing. To me, and I can only speak for myself, this is like your eye is just off the ball. You're just paying attention to the wrong thing, where it's nice to have people nominated for these things, but they're irrelevant in the scheme of what's important. And what you should be caring about is education and all that.
Right.
But the media has made such an importance out of this that it's like it's getting the black community's eye off what's actually important, which would be education and family and some of the other stuff.
I couldn't agree with you more. I have an actor friend, and I said, why is this important to you? And he said, because it provides role models and enhances the self-esteem of black people. That's what he said. Mm-hmm. I said, are you aware that black boys and black girls have higher self-esteem than white girls and white boys? This has been tested for decades. It's been the case for a long time. And there are very, very few Asian actors and actresses, yet Asian Americans, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, and Korean Americans on a per capita basis make more money than virtually anybody else in this country. So it's utterly irrelevant.
Yeah.
And for us to pay attention to this, and it's also not true. If you look at the last 15 years or so, roughly 10% or so of the nominees for the major categories have been black people. There have been a couple of years where there's been a shutout, but add it all up, it's about parity with population.
Right, so that's the irony. It's within a couple of percentage points,
Right.
it actually has been a
Right.
parity.
And Jamie Foxx, who got an Oscar for Ray,
Right.
said in connection with this Oscar so white movement, he said, act better. Be better. Mm-hmm. Raise your game. Don't demand, don't yell, don't scream, get better, act better.
Yeah.
He got an Oscar. And I think part of the reason he said that is because it kind of demeans his Oscar.
Right, because then it means
you're complaining that Oscars are so white. How did I get one? I was lucky?
Yeah.
Maybe, just maybe, I was excellent.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So do you think that at times visibility is important? So for example, I've had Jack A. Harry on here. She was the first black woman. I think she won for Best Supporting Actress in 227, around, I guess it's around 1989 or so. Mm-hmm. At that time, do you think that a certain amount of visibility may have been more important than it is now? Like, because finally a black person did it. Even if you don't think that the thing in and of itself is important.
I don't think so. I remember some years ago there was an Olympic black skier named Debbie Thomas, I believe was her last name, and she was the first black Olympiad in ice skating, and she was constantly asked, "Who are your role models? Who are your role models? Who inspired you?" And finally, to me, out of exasperation, she said, "I don't need to see somebody black do something before I think I can do it." And that's how I feel. If I want to do something, what's holding me back from doing it, other than my own insecurities or inadequacies? Just get up, make it happen.
Yeah. How exhausting is this conversation to you? I don't mean this literal conversation right now, but just this thing, you know, so much of what you talk about has to, unfortunately, be framed around something that you don't even think is real. You know what I mean? It's something that you think should be put behind us, that actually is behind us, and yet you have to talk about it a lot. Just on a personal note, how does that feel for you?
It doesn't bother me. I think there's a lot of feeling that race and racism remain major problems in America. And I think that you're approaching this with sincerity and real concern. I just don't think it's that big of a deal.
Yeah. By the way, I've emailed DeRay McKesson to have him on, who's the lead, I think the quasi-leader of Black Lives Matter. He hasn't responded, but I will ask him again. So I'm not just playing favorites here. Mm-hmm, you know, mm-hmm. I'm just putting that out there.
No problem. This is America. There are Cubans who are braving shark-infested waters to get here. There are people from Central America coming up here. Why do people come here? Why do so many people want to come to America? And it's because it is the land of the free and the home of the brave. It is a place where you can go from nothing to something faster than at any time and anywhere than in all of human history. That's why we're here. And to me, again, you are almost giving the forefinger to all the people who fought, struggled, worked hard, and died for people to sit around in 2017 and bitch, moan, and whine about race and racism.
Yeah, I suspect I know your answer to this, but what do you make of all these people that now want to look back on history and label everyone racist from back then? You know, I was at Monticello, which was Thomas Jefferson's home.
Yeah.
Thomas Jefferson, who owned slaves, who was sleeping with at least one slave, I think several, who they, by the way, at Monticello, I took the tour, this was only about a year and a half ago, they fully owned up to everything. They did not, I thought it was incredible what they did.
Right.
They said this man was writing the laws to free the slaves at the same time he was sleeping with his slaves, which I think you could probably make an argument was rape in a certain respect because they weren't equals, right? Now, I'm not saying he's a rapist in the conventional sense, but I can see that argument being made. But what about that concept that we're going to look back, that what I think the left is now trying to do is look at all of our founding fathers and take them out of give our 2017 morality to them who lived very complex lives. I mean, without Thomas Jefferson, the slaves do not get freed as quickly as they did.
Well, I think the idea of going back and airbrushing history and looking at history through the filter of today's morality is pretty silly. I think all a state can be is just in its own time, and that's what we're trying to be and trying to do right now. And people are right to call slavery America's original sin, but without a compromise, you wouldn't have had an America. And there was 750,000 people, both sides, who died in order to free the slaves. And people don't really have an understanding of the scale of the sacrifice that people made. 750,000 people at a time when this country was just 10% the size of what it is. So that's like 7.5 million people dying in order for there to be an outcome where slaves are freed. And those are the people that died, not the ones who've been injured. It was a horrific thing that America went through. And on the other side comes the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, the Civil Rights Movement, and all the things that have happened since then. Yeah. But this was a country that went to war over this proposition.
Yeah. What do you make of this intersectional thing that we have going on now? And I think we saw a lot of it at the Women's March this past weekend, where there's a certain amount of people that are trying to conflate trans issues with black issues, and then Muslim issues with women's issues, and just this whole thing where, you know, I talk about all the time, this oppression Olympics, and now they're all tied together by this oppression, but they all have to kind of beat each other in oppression to be the winner. This is a toxic mess, huh?
It is. It's what I call the victocrat culture, where everybody has a grievance and everybody's making a demand on the government to solve that grievance. When in fact we have far more in common than we have apart, and we ought to celebrate our similarities, and we're not doing that.
Okay, so let's move to Trump then. I think what you said there is an interesting segue to Trump. So there seems to be this feeling that the white supremacists are back. They're back in business.
And white boys are back.
And it's because of Trump. So I saw this. Did you see this video of this guy, Richard Spencer, who's the alt-right guy?
The guy got punched.
He got punched. I tweeted out that this guy has obviously bad ideas. I've had family members on both sides of my family killed in the Holocaust, so I am not a Nazi sympathizer in any way. But I have to defend his right to free speech without being punched, because that's the whole point. You can't just defend it when it's easy. You got to defend it when you don't want to, and that's. But I saw a lot of people on the left, a lot of famous people, a lot of people with a lot of influence saying, no, it's okay to punch Nazis, which if you just follow their logic through, well, he could have killed him because you could accidentally kill somebody. And then if it's okay to punch a random person because of their beliefs, can we blow up his car? Can we bomb his house? I mean, this is a horrifically slippery slope, right?
Of course it is. Is it okay for me to burn up a building because I'm unhappy because of the way the police treat me? Are riots perfectly okay? Would it be okay if somebody walked up to John Lewis and punched him because they feel that John Lewis should have attended the Donald Trump inaugural? Where do we go with this? Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
And believe me, it would have been a huge story if there had been somebody like John Lewis who had been punched, as opposed to this Spencer guy that the media doesn't care about and feels is loathsome. I understand that, but I would have thought there would have been a little more coverage of it, but there wasn't very much.
Yeah, so I know a certain amount of people are going to watch this and go, wait a minute. Here's a black guy and a Jew somehow defending a Nazi's right to free speech. He wants to, I'm pretty sure he'd want to kick both of us out of the country or something close to that. But it's tough to have principles, right? I mean, isn't that the crux of what you're saying? Basically, the through line of all of this is you got to have some principles.
Wasn't it Voltaire who said, I disagree with what you said, but I would defend to my death your right to say it? I mean, we're talking about principles here.
Yeah.
Free speech.
So
and by the way, it's not unlawful to hate somebody. You can hate somebody. As you pointed out earlier, you can't put your hand on that person, but you have every right to dislike somebody for whatever reason you want.
Yeah. All right, well, Larry, it was a pleasure. We're going to do a little bonus segment for our Patreon audience, and I thank you for coming back.
My pleasure.
And we're going to link to the original one, and people can see if maybe I changed you in some ways too. Who knows?
Well, I felt the same way leaving as I felt coming. How's that?
Fair enough. All right, for more on Larry, check out his website, larryelder.com.